This is the Kofford Books AuthorCast. I'm your host, Brian Whitney. Adam Miller is a professor of philosophy at Collin College in McKinney, Texas. He is the author or editor of 9 books, including Rube Goldberg Machines, Speculative Grace, Letters to a Young Mormon, and Nothing New Under the Sun. He also serves as director of the Mormon Theology Seminar. In Future Mormon, Adam speaks to the rising generation of Latter-day Saints. In his own words, every generation must work out their own salvation. Every generation must live its own lives and think its own thoughts and receive its own revelations. And, if Mormonism continues to matter, it will be because future generations, rather than leaving, were willing to be Mormon all over again. Like our grandparents, like our parents, and like us, they will have to rethink the whole tradition, from top to bottom, right from the beginning, and make it their own in order to embody Christ anew in this passing world. To the degree that we can help, our job is to model that work in love, and then to offer them the tools, the raw materials, and the room to do it themselves. These essays are a modest contribution in this vein, a future tense apologetics meant for future Mormons. They model a thoughtful and creative engagement with Mormon ideas while sketching possible directions for future thinking. In this episode, we interview Adam Miller. Welcome to the show, Adam Miller.
Thanks.
So why don't you go ahead and distinguish for us Future Mormon from your previous work with us, Rube Goldberg.
Well, they're very similar, I think, collections of essays. In both books, the essays were written for a variety of venues over a period of years. And so depending on the venue and depending on the audience and depending on the kind of thing the paper was trying to do, I think the collection is it's a bit of a grab bag. But I think in general, the essays collected together in Future Mormon are less poetic and more straightforward and probably more accessible than some of the essays in Rube Goldberg.
In the preface of Future Mormon, you discuss this as a future tense apologetics. Can you explain what that means to our listeners?
Yeah, well, there's a sense in which the essays here are defending the faith, defending the kind of Mormon version of Christianity that's near and dear to me. But I think that defense takes a different kind of mode than the normal brand of apologetics that people are probably more familiar with. I think what I'm doing in Future Mormon with what I describe as a future tense apologetics is something more like seed planting. I'm acting here more as a farmer than as a warrior, right? Rather than being Joshua riding in with the hosts of Israel to vanquish the Canaanites, which is a kind of typical, I think, argumentative version of apologetics. I'm something more like Joseph of Egypt, here planting seeds and collecting crops and gathering materials into storehouses for future generations to use as they see fit. So this kind of
lovely.
Yeah. So this kind of future tense apologetics, I think it's experimental, and it tries to refrain from deciding for those future Mormons what the kinds of things that they'll have to decide for themselves as they work out their salvation.
As I was going through the book, they seem kind of like meditations on a variety of topics, just directing the reader perhaps towards a broader understanding, particularly of the general theory of grace. Question that came up with me as I was reading this is, what assumptions do you think we carry as Latter-day Saints that might be getting in our way of realizing a general theory of grace?
Well, I think we've assumed for a long time that grace was a word that belonged to mainline Protestantism, but wasn't really a very good fit for Mormonism. There are a lot of historical reasons for that. But I think that in the end, it's a word that, as a tradition, we were inevitably going to swing back around to using and owning, and maybe even finding our own unique ways of deploying, because it's a word that even more, I think, than the Bible saturates the Book of Mormon. And so, in the end, I think it's inevitable that we come back around to owning that word and reclaiming it and trying to think harder about it.
The majority of the essays have an exegetical or at least a pastoral tone to it. Where does Future Mormon fit into the current scholarly dialogue on grace?
I would say the book's tone is para-academic. Right? There's a lot of scholarly academic tools being put to work in different ways in different essays in the book, but they're often being put to use for not quite scholarly ends. The essays often have a kind of a pastoral or existential urgency to the kinds of questions that I'm raising, and I don't. I'm not satisfied to have those questions just raised in a vacuum, apart from what they might mean for us. So I think the book kind of straddles the gap between the world of academia and the world of everyday, on the ground life that we have to, work our way through. So I think it's kind of borderline, right? Borderline scholarly and borderline pastoral or existential.
Now, besides Future Mormon, you devote a significant amount of your writing, and I'm thinking of Letters to a Young Mormon, and as well as your blog post, Letter to a CES Student, which has recently regained some interest in the internet world. You devote a lot of your writing to a Christ-centric rather than a church-centric approach. In what ways do you think Future Mormon expands on this focus?
Yeah, well, I think that's not a bad description, Christ-centric rather than church-centric, but I think the church itself is aiming to be Christ-centric, and so in some ways it's a mistake on our part to think that being centered on the church is what the church itself would want, right? Because one of the ways that I talk about this in the Letter to a CES Student, which has recently had a kind of second life, but I think I wrote 18 months, 2 years ago, or something like that. The internet's kind of a funny place. Things circulate back into people's attention. But one of the points that I make in that letter is that I think it's a mistake for this kind of reason. I think it's a mistake to think that Mormonism is about Mormonism. Right? It's a mistake to think in the same way that my life ought to be about me. If I spend my time worrying about whether or not I'm happy and worrying about whether or not my own life is meaningful, if I spend my time worrying about whether those things are true for me, then I'm not going to end up doing the kinds of things that will make me happy or help my life to be meaningful, right? And I think the same kind of thing tends to be true with respect to Mormonism in general. If I think that my life is about me, then I'm going to ruin my life, and I'm going to feel like a fraud. And I think the same thing ends up being true with Mormonism. If I think that Mormonism is about Mormonism, then I'm going to miss the point of Mormonism, because Mormonism isn't about Mormonism, it's actually about Christ. And Mormonism is going to end up looking and feeling like a fraud, because it will have been a fraud if it attempts to be about itself. So in the same kind of way that my own life can come into focus only when I stop focusing on me, I think that's true with respect to Mormonism. Mormonism can only come into focus as being substantial and worthwhile and valuable and truthful and authentic only when I'm focusing on Christ.
So let's dig into a few specifics within Future Mormon. I found it interesting that you devoted a couple of your essays responding to Terrell and Fiona Givens' The God Who Weeps, as well as Terrell Givens' Wrestling the Angel. Before we talk about any specifics within those books, why don't you tell me why you chose those particular works?
Well, I think both of those books are excellent, both Terrell and Fiona's work in The God Who Weeps, and maybe even more so Terrell Gibbons' Wrestling the Angel. These books are the high watermark for contemporary work in Mormon studies, both meant for a popular audience, especially with The God Who Weeps, and meant for an academic audience with Terrell Gibbons' Wrestling the Angel. And so I think as the kind of high watermark of where we're at, they deserve our time and attention and thoughtfulness.
But you don't agree with all of their platforms, and you make this fairly clear with your essay that discusses The God Who Weeps. You criticize some of the Platonic approaches to premortality, particularly the notion that premortality was, quote, what's real, and that our present selves are pale shadows. You called the ideal pre-self a sticky fiction. Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, well, I'm coming at a lot of these problems from a very different perspective than the Gibbonses are. Terrell in particular works out of kind of Mormon history of ideas type perspective, whereas I come at a lot of these same questions from the perspective of contemporary philosophy. Now, there's certainly some overlap there, but I think we're working in some ways with different kinds of tools on different kinds of questions. And so it's maybe not surprising that we don't agree about everything. Plus, I think any book that you read that you don't find worth disagreeing with is probably not that great of a book, really. One thing I disagree with The God Who Weeps about is the way that it treats the notion of a premortal self. And part of what happens there in the book, and the book is pretty explicit about this, is that the premortal self gets treated as if it were the kind of real, ideal, unsullied, unsticky, uncomplicated, unmessy version of ourselves, right? A kind of the truthful kernel at the center of who we are that's not compromised like our earthly selves by all the kinds of messy, material, bodily, social, political, environmental forces that constantly buffet us and restrict our agency and our knowledge, etc. Now, The God Who Weeps posits then our premortal self then as a kind of answer to the messiness of our earthly selves, of our mortal selves, because our premortal self isn't messy in the same kind of way. But for my part, I think it's a mistake to think about our premortal selves in that same kind of way. I think it's often the problems that we experience as human beings related to pride and sin and selfishness, that the misuse of our agency, they have to do with our fantasy of a kind of underlying ideal self that isn't compromised or complicated in the way that our messy earthly selves are. And I disagree and think that clinging to the notion of an ideal self that's free from complication and compromise, that's in the end part of the problem and not part of the answer. I think in the end our salvation involves a kind of reconciliation with the compromise and complication we see on display here in our mortal lives, rather than a kind of elimination of that compromise and complication.
Coming soon from Greg Kofford Books, Writing Ourselves, Essays on Creativity, Craft, and Mormonism by Jack Harrell. Continuing a conversation as old as Mormonism itself, Harrell explores the relationship between Mormonism and the writer. Mormons see the universe in mythic proportions. Their God is a creator, their devil a destroyer. This makes meaningful conflict fundamental to their worldview and begs the terms for religious redemption, as well as the redemptive power of art. Harrell urges writers to be authentic as they embrace the difficulties inherent in the creative process. His essays blend faithful intellectual inquiry, personal narrative, research, and application to offer insights for anyone who cares about writing, creativity, and the human condition. Writing Ourselves will be available June 14th. Pre-order your copy today at gregkofford.com. Okay, let's move on to how you responded to wrestling the angel. And among the various points that you make, one of the points that you call out is what you call the theological knots that are endemic to the tradition, notably Mormonism's commitment to materialism. And you have a slightly different take on materialism than perhaps Terrell Givens does. Can you briefly explain some of the differences?
Yeah, so these are some thoughts that crystallized for me while reading Givens's Wrestling the Angel, which is a kind of offers a kind of systematic historical overview of many ideas basic to Mormon theology, and the book is excellent, and I highly recommend it. But one of the things that really crystallized for me while reading it is the way that we can see in this history of Mormon ideas a kind of miniature version of a problem that the entire Western philosophical and theological tradition has struggled with since its inception 2,500 years ago, right? From the very beginning, Western philosophy has had a strong bias just in terms of how it frames its fundamental questions. It's had a strong bias towards different forms of idealism rather than materialism. And materialism, matter, has always ended up being in some way or other the bad guy in the history of the Western tradition. That's true, I think, philosophically, but that's probably even more true theologically, especially given the way that Augustine and Aquinas give us our fundamental articulations of Christian ideas in terms of Plato and Aristotle, respectively. Now, I think what we get with Mormonism is an attempt on Joseph Smith's part to introduce a version of Christianity that is not grounded in a kind of philosophical, epistemological, or metaphysical idealism, but that instead is grounded in a thoroughgoing materialism, such that we get claims in the Doctrine and Covenants, canonized claims in our Scripture that there is no such thing as immaterial matter, that all things that exist are in some way material, and that goes for spirit, and that goes for souls, and that goes for God, etc. Now the trouble is, for us, is we get these really striking foundational claims from Joseph Smith and in our Scripture about the priority of materialism, but then we're still dealing with, we're still using by default all of these traditional ways of speaking that we inherit from the Christian tradition that depend both implicitly and explicitly on different forms of idealism. And so part of what I think we see in Terrell's book and his account of the history of Mormon ideas is we see this kind of constant tension throughout Mormon theology between that attempt to be a materialist and the way that never quite fits with all of the traditional idealistic forms that we've inherited from the rest of Christianity. And so I think a lot of the work going forward for Mormon philosophers and theologians, a lot of the work going forward is going to have to be centered on thinking very carefully about what it actually would mean to be a radical and thoroughgoing materialist, the kind of materialist that Joseph Smith seems to point us towards being, to think very carefully about what materialism is, and then on the other hand to go about rethinking some of these basic Christian ideas that we share with the rest of the tradition, but rethinking them now in light of a materialism rather than an idealism. Now that sounds very philosophical, and in lots of ways it is kind of philosophical and technical, but I think the results on the ground could end up being very interesting, very practical.
I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit because I think it's in the same line of thought as what you were talking about here, and I'm going to jump to chapter 9, where in this essay you ask the question, "Can we be Christians without being Platonists?"
Yeah.
There seems to be in this a challenge to the Christian teleological view that Augustine espoused, and I'm thinking particularly in the City of God, right, where you've got this idealized city of God in the beyond, and then you've got the city of man that struggles and rises and falls here, but that city of man is eventually progressing towards this idealized state of the city of God. And it seems like in chapter 9, you're disrupting that, challenging that thought, and perhaps that's in line with modern philosophical thinking. But can you fill in what I'm trying to reach here?
Yeah, there's a couple essays in the Future Mormon collection that address these kinds of questions pretty explicitly. One was the essay you indicated. Is it possible to be a Christian and not a Platonist? In that essay, I explore the different kinds of decisions we would have to make in order for that to be possible. But in lots of ways, I intend it as an open question, whether is this possible to be a Christian and not a Platonist? Because as you point out, right from the very beginning, especially by the time we get to Augustine and things start to be set relatively, right, the concrete starts to harden and set in ways that are going to be important for the rest of the tradition. By that point, Plato, Platonic thinking, and the kind of idealism that informs so much of the Neoplatonism that was crucial for Augustine, right, that's become so interwoven with how we think about Christian ideas that at this point, for us, 2,000 years-ish later, right, it's hard for us to even imagine what a kind of pre-Platonic Christianity would have looked like, or how they would have even thought about basic questions about the nature of the soul, or about, as you indicated, right, a kind of governing teleology that organizes the whole of human existence. One of the basic things I think that would be involved in thinking about Christian ideas from a materialist rather than an idealistic perspective would involve a kind of loosening of the grip of teleology on how we think about human destiny, and allowing a more kind of evolutionary model to inform how we think about what it means to have purpose and direction, allowing for purpose and direction to emerge out of local interactions rather than being imposed on matter from the outside from some kind of ideal position. And again, that ends up being a relatively complicated thing, I think, to try to think about these ideas from a materialist rather than an idealistic perspective. But I think it's also really interesting and really fruitful.
I'm going to back up to your essay in Chapter 8, the Manifesto for Future Mormon Thinking, because I think that there's a tie-in with this idea of transfiguring the secular. Can you expand on what transfiguring the secular means?
Well, yeah, Chapter 8 is an essay called A Manifesto for the Future of Mormon Thinking. And I propose in that essay that the key to the future of Mormon thinking is that Mormon thinking needs to become fearless. And as John points out in 1 John, the only way for that thinking to become fearless is for love to cast out our fear. So the fearless Mormon thinking is thinking that's conducted as an act of love. And really, in the end, as Jesus points out, our love only becomes substantial when that love is offered not just for our friends, but for our enemies. So I look at two different case studies in that essay and try to think about what it would mean for us to love our intellectual enemies, right? And so one position that's frequently identified as the enemy of Mormonism is secularism, right? Secularism is our enemy. So if secularism is our enemy, I ask, well, what would it look like then for us as Mormons to love secularism if we're supposed to love our enemies? And I think part of what happens is if we attempt here to love secularism as our enemy, part of what happens is that we refuse, as a result, we refuse to allow secularism to position itself as our enemy. Right? We refuse to allow secularism to define itself as the not religious. Right? We contest that kind of basic distinction that secularism draws between the secular and the religious. We contest the validity of that distinction, and as a result, we don't let secularism frame us or us frame secularism as the enemy. If we do that, then I think that we'll have kind of reframed what's at stake in secularism itself and open the door to a kind of productive, potential future working partnership with secular ideas, allowing them to be in dialogue with rather than identifying them as the enemy of the things that matter to us as Mormons.
And I think for a lot of people, secularism and humanism somewhat go hand in hand. And you take on the case of humanism in one of your essays responding to President Uchtdorf's talk, The Gift of Grace. You stated that it offered a long-needed corrective to our tendency to read the gospel as kind of a secular manual for can-do humanism and self-improvement. Why do you think humanism and self-improvement are particular dangers within Mormonism?
I think there's a way in which our affinity for materialism goes hand in hand with an affinity for humanism. Right? There's a kind of deep sympathy, I think, in how Mormonism thinks about the world and about Christian ideas. There's a kind of deep sympathy there for the anthropos, for the human, for putting the human center stage, right? On the other hand, there's kind of, as I point out in the essay, where I reflect a bit on President Uchtdorf's talk, The Gift of Grace. On the other hand, there's a kind of danger there in Mormonism boiling down to a kind of do-it-yourself version of religion, a kind of can-do humanism, a kind of gospel of self-improvement that I think doesn't fit very well with not only with kind of basic Mormon ideas about the centrality of Christ to our salvation, but it doesn't fit very well in the end with what it looks like to actually be a messy and complicated human being who is dependent on the world and the people around us and God for all kinds of things that we could never hope to do for ourselves.
Let's discuss Chapter 12, where you tackle the question, is the church true? Which is a very popular question today. You hear it a lot from online social media, particularly those who are going through questions and doubts regarding the church's claims. But you point out in this the flaws that are inherent in that question, and you seem to state it that it made sense in more of a 19th century sectarian context, but may not be as relevant to us today. You wrote that the question is just too thin. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, that kind of question, right, is the kind of question that Joseph Smith takes into the grove with him, right, in 1820. And he asks God, which of all the churches is true? And that, for Joseph Smith, I think that particular form of all the questions, right, he could have asked, of all the questions about God and religion and his human condition and sinfulness and death, and right, of all the questions he could have asked, that question for him at that point in time kind of gathered up all of the things that he needed to know and summarize them very forcefully, I think, in a way that would allow God to respond very directly. And I think the usefulness and the forcefulness of that particular question, is the church true? I think that depended a lot on his historical context, on the way that in his world, in his time, in his place, posing the question in that way was really potent and gathered up all the kinds of things that he needed to have answered. I think it's not quite the same for us. I think we live in a different kind of world. We live in a global, cosmopolitan, information age type of world in which that question, while not meaningless, doesn't work in the same kind of way to gather up what is for you and I the basic, fundamental religious questions. Right? For us, we have at heart, I think, the same kinds of problems, and we need the same kinds of answers that Joseph Smith did. But that particular question, it doesn't have the same kind of force with respect to gathering up the questions that we have and soliciting from God a kind of direct answer. So it's not that I think the question is wrong or that it couldn't, even that the question couldn't be answered affirmatively. But I think for us, in our day and our time, it ends up being a very thin question, and it gets thinner all the time. I think it's not a kind of load-bearing question the way that it used to be in a different context, in a different world. For one, it assumes that the basic religious question is a question about the character of an institution. And I think that religious questions don't tend to press on us in that same kind of way, in that same kind of directly institutional way, in the same way that they used to. Right? And it assumes that the basic question to be asked about the institution is verifying its institutional bona fides. Well, the church as an institution is important, but the church is not the be-all, end-all of religious life. Mormonism, as we pointed out earlier, is not about Mormonism. And I think if we want to get if we want to get useful answers about Mormonism, then we have to ask these questions not first and foremost about Mormonism, but we have to ask these questions about the thing that Mormonism is itself about. And again, I think that's Christ. Only Christ, I think, is worthy of being at the center of our religious and existential crises, right? And if we get, even if we got the institutional question right, if we still missed Christ as a result, then why would the institution matter? But if we connect with Christ, I think then the way in which the institution is true and does matter, then I think that can come into proper focus and find its proper place. It can do us a lot of good.
That was Adam Miller, author of Future Mormon, Essays in Mormon Theology, available on May 17th in paperback and ebook from Greg Kofford Books. Thank you for listening to the Kofford Books AuthorCast. You can subscribe to us on iTunes and Google Play, and be sure to like us on Facebook to receive the latest information about our authors, releases, and promotions.